Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I am Joel Dodge, and I'm chair of the ACS New York Lawyer Chapter, and we are really thrilled to present today's discussion, Progress on Our Plates, Legal and Regulatory Issues in Alternative Proteins, along with our fellow lawyer chapters in the Bay Area, in Austin, in Virginia, and the at-large lawyer chapter. Thank you so much for co-sponsoring today's event with us. The future of food has come into clearer view in recent years, thanks to advances in alternative proteins. From so-called meatless meat, such as high-quality plant-based meat products, to cultivated meat products that are on the horizon, like slaughter-free, cellular-based meat, innovations in alternative proteins are poised to revolutionize how we eat, with transformative implications for animal welfare, for the climate, for public health, and beyond. But this transformation faces critical legal and regulatory roadblocks that could slow down its progress that we are going to talk about today. Joining us to discuss the present and future of alternative proteins is Madeline Cohen, Senior Regulatory Attorney at the Good Food Institute, the DC think tank focused on the advancement of alternative proteins. We will save time for your questions toward the end of the hour. So please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom at any time as we talk. So let's get started. Maddie, thanks so much for being here. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to focus on alternative proteins in your legal practice? What was your path to this work like?
Sure. So I started my legal career knowing I wanted to do something related to litigation, wasn't really sure what. So I did a clerkship with a federal judge, and then I worked as a litigation associate at a law firm for several years, but wasn't completely doing what I was passionate about and was really looking to break into something where I could use my skills in the climate and environmental space. And just sort of happened to stumble upon GFI's work at just the right time. And so it was honestly partly just luck. And I've really had the chance over the past almost 2 years to really dive into both kind of the science and industry, and then also the legal, regulatory, and policy issues around alternative proteins. And I can provide a bit of background about GFI too, if that would be helpful. As Joel mentioned, we're a nonprofit organization that essentially acts as a think tank and a field catalyst for the alternative protein industry. And our goal is to create a more sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. And GFI has 3 programmatic teams. So we have our policy team, which I'm a member of, and then we have a science and technology team that both does their own research and provides research grants in the alternative protein space. And then we have a corporate engagement team as well, who works directly with companies, especially startups, to provide kind of information and help them get going. And our policy work specifically includes kind of traditional legislative work on the Hill, regulatory advocacy, litigation, and then also global regulatory work through multilateral orgs like the UNFAO and the World Health Organization.
That's great. Thanks, Maddie. Perhaps, and maybe we should have started with this, but could we just define what we mean by alternative proteins? Like, how does the Good Food Institute define what constitutes an alternative protein?
Sure. So we consider alternative proteins to be any alternatives to conventional meat, eggs, or dairy. And they generally fall under 3 categories: plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation-derived. So plant-based proteins are the ones that I'm sure everyone's familiar with, and it would include something like an Impossible Burger or oat milk or almond milk or just eggs. And then cultivated proteins are produced by actually directly cultivating animal cells. So you take a biopsy of animal cells. It can be from an animal or from an egg or even from a chicken feather, and grow and differentiate those cells and arrange them in the same structure that they would be found in an animal. So you can essentially cultivate, a chicken breast or a duck wing or a hamburger without actually needing to raise and slaughter animals in order to do that. And then fermentation-derived proteins can sort of be further divided into 2 categories. You have biomass fermentation products that are essentially using fermentation to quickly replicate something like a fungi or a microbe. So if you've ever seen products from the company Quorn, Quorn, they use biomass fermentation to make their fungi-based like chicken patties and nuggets and other foods like that. And then there are also proteins that you can create using a process called precision fermentation, which is the process that's used to make a lot of enzymes. It's used to make rennet for cheese, things like that. And that involves training a single-celled organism like a yeast to produce or express proteins that would normally be found in animal products like whey protein or egg whites.
Got it. That's really helpful. What does the industry see as the key benefits of alternative proteins?
Sure. Yeah, there's really a kind of wide variety of issues that we're looking to solve by promoting these new products and technologies. In terms of climate and the environment, producing alternative protein products generally results in far fewer GHG emissions compared to conventional animal protein products, especially beef and milk. And alternative proteins also tend to use a lot less land and water, and they contribute less to things like erosion, eutrophication, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, deforestation, compared to most animal products. And then also in terms of public health, alternative proteins can help solve a few of the crises that we're currently facing, like antibiotic resistance and zoonotic diseases. We are kind of unfortunately rapidly losing the fight against antibiotic resistant bacteria, and it's largely due to this consistent low level use of antibiotics in industrial animal agriculture. And the same sort of intensive animal agriculture also leads to outbreak of zoonotic diseases that both threaten the food supply because animals have to be culled, but also risk human health because they can jump to humans and cause pandemics. So making protein products that don't require this intensive raising of animals can help eliminate these threats. And then on more of a global scale, alternative proteins can also help ensure food security, especially in regions that aren't currently able to grow sufficient food when there are droughts or catastrophic weather events, which we know are just going to keep increasing due to climate change.
So just to follow up on a couple of those benefits, zoonotic diseases are essentially things like avian flu or in other diseases, correct? Like things that are prone to spreading in part because we are packing animals in close confines and factory farms, essentially. Is that right?
Yes, and they're diseases that can be transferred from one species to another, and some are eventually transferred from animal species to humans. That's how we've ended up with things like avian flu or like H1N1 that have jumped from
Right.
animal species to humans. But also, as you mentioned, it's even just spreading intensely within those animal populations often means those animals are then culled and then they can't produce the food, which is part of the reason that we've seen egg prices increase. And we expect that to be more frequent in the future just due to what the climate is doing to our food systems.
Right. I guess that's another benefit of alternative proteins, right? Is that when we see spikes in egg prices or meat prices, like in theory, once the products are fully scaled up, alternative proteins could be like a steady substitute or alternative when we see soaring prices for other types of food. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also just a way to kind of make our food supply more secure through diversification. When we don't have the option to eat certain products, these products may be more likely to be available because, they're grown under controlled conditions and they're not necessarily going to be as affected by, climate disasters and emergencies and other things like that. So it really just adds diversity to our protein supply.
You mentioned antibiotic resistance also, and I wanted to just spend a second talking about that because I don't know if everyone necessarily knows what that is. It seems like this looming problem in the background, but every time I think about it, it just seems like this terrifying notion that because we are pumping factory farm animals full of antibiotics. Like antibiotics are gradually stopping to be effective. Could you just say a bit more about that problem and how alternative proteins could correct for it?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that it's pretty terrifying. Some scientists have called it the potential end of modern medicine. So it is a bit doom and gloom, but it's for a good reason. We have a limited number of antibiotics available. Pharmaceutical companies are not regularly developing new antibiotics, both because it's expensive and because it's not something that's necessarily incentivized in the market compared to other products. So we're not getting a bunch of new antibiotics made available to us. And at the same time, the ones that we do have available are becoming less and less effective as the proportion of bacteria population that is resistant to those antibiotics grows. And essentially that happens through the overuse of antibiotics. And also sort of the constant low level use of them to prevent disease rather than using them when a person or an animal has a known infection.
And I think I saw in GFI's materials, which if you're interested in this topic, you all should check out GFI's website. They have tons of great resources. But I think I saw that the overwhelming majority of antibiotics are basically being used for factory farm animal purposes. Is that right?
Yeah, and with alternative proteins, because we're not requiring the raising of large number of animals, it just sort of eliminates the need to use these high amounts of antibiotics just to create food for one person.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got a few different categories of alternative proteins. In terms of the consumer perspective, what can you buy in stores or restaurants right now, and then what is coming in the not too distant future?
Yeah, so right now there's both plant-based and fermentation-enabled foods. So like I mentioned before, your plant-based burgers, milks, eggs, cheeses. In terms of fermentation-enabled foods, there are the biomass ones, which are kind of similar to the plant-based meat products, but then also fermentation, precision fermentation has been used to create a lot of whey protein without the use of animals. So it's being used in things like animal-free chocolate, ice cream, milk, cream cheese, like protein powder. There's also animal-free egg whites that are now available that can be used as an ingredient in a variety of things. So I think that's one space that's really growing, and you'll see more things that you would normally think would have like a minimal amount of, say, milk or eggs in them that are now going to be available animal-free because they're made with milk or egg proteins that have been created by these yeast cells. So you might see that in more things like cheeses or baked goods. And then cultivated meat products are not on the market yet, but they will be fairly soon, which I think we're going to talk a little bit more about in a minute.
Yeah, I think that leads to my next question, which is about the FDA approval of cultivated cellular grown chicken from a company called Upside Foods. Can you tell us a bit more about what that means, like what the implications are from that for consumers and for other cellular-based meat products that are in the...
Sure. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, back in November, FDA completed its first ever pre-market consultation process for a cultivated meat product. And the product was cultivated chicken cells from a company, as Joel mentioned, called Upside Foods, who will be using these to create a variety of cultivated chicken products. And this is a sort of a new regulatory process that FDA has set up in conjunction with USDA to kind of evaluate the safety of these products. And so this was a major milestone in the path to market for cultivated meat, but it's not the end of the regulatory requirements because FDA and USDA share jurisdiction over cultivated meat products if they're made from cells of animals that USDA already has jurisdiction over. And USDA has jurisdiction over livestock like cows and pigs, as well as poultry and catfish. So for all of those products, if you're making a cultivated meat product with those animals, then USDA will also have jurisdiction. For products like seafood and eggs, FDA has sole jurisdiction. But Upside's product is made from chicken cells, so USDA also has some regulatory authority here. So Upside will have to obtain a grant of inspection from USDA, and then USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service will routinely inspect their facility during operation, very similar to the way that USDA currently inspects conventional meat slaughtering and meat processing facilities. And Upside also needs to get its labels pre-approved by USDA before it can sell the product. So the labels that will actually be on any packages that go to restaurants and grocery stores also require USDA approval. So there are some regulatory steps left before we see this on the market. And it's likely that we'll see it in restaurants before grocery stores, just because it'll take a while to scale up to be able to make enough to sell in stores, and also because it's going to probably start at a higher price point again until it's scaled. What it means for other companies, I mean, just having the information from FDA on everything that they evaluated during this process is really valuable for other companies, because now they know kind of what information FDA needs to see in order for them to demonstrate that their product is safe. And we do know that some other companies have already kind of started communicating with FDA and are working their way through FDA's process as well, but we don't know where they are in the process or how long it will be until we see a green light for their products as well.
Yeah, I believe I saw that there's a restaurant in San Francisco that's already contracted with Upside Foods to sell, to serve their cultivated chicken once there is full approval. So for those of you who are joining from the Bay Area, be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, I believe
Maddie, do you have a sense?
Dominique Cren's
go ahead.
restaurant. I would say it's Dominique Cren's restaurant. She's a very famous French chef.
Cool. Yep. So do you have a sense of how long that process, now that the FDA has kind of completed its review, now that it's over to USDA, like what's the timeline there? Like do you have any projection on when restaurants are going to be selling cultivated chicken based on how long things usually take with the USDA?
It's really hard to know. I mean, usually it would take a few months. They have to put together a HACCP plan and all these written protocols for their facility that have to be submitted to USDA, so that USDA can ensure that the facility is up to its normal standards of ensuring that the food produced there is wholesome and safe. And normally that might take a few months, but because this is the first time it's ever being done for a cultivated meat facility, there's a potential for it to take longer. There could potentially be more back and forth with the agency over the details of things like that. But it's really hard to predict because this is the first time this has ever been done. So we don't really have examples from the past to look at.
Got it. So outside of the regulatory approval process, what are the key legal issues or barriers that are facing the alternative proteins industry?
Sure. I would kind of divide the primary issues into two categories, one being legislative and one regulatory. On the legislative side, as I think we might talk about a bit more later, the federal government pours hundreds of millions of dollars into supporting agriculture every year, but not nearly a fraction of that, is devoted to alternative protein R&D. The government's also really started to fund climate smart technologies like EVs and infrastructure electrification at a much larger scale, but doesn't yet seem to see alternative proteins in the same light, even though we have a lot of significant research supporting the fact that these products are a potential climate solution. So I think that's just one area where a lot more government action would result in a much faster acceleration of these products to market. The second issue, which is more regulatory in nature, is labeling. At the federal level, as I mentioned, FDA and USDA have jurisdiction over food labeling, but there also is some gray area that's left up to the states. With respect to cultivated meat, the statutes that give USDA jurisdiction over these various products like terrestrial meat and poultry are the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act. And those both have really broad and strong preemption provisions. So there's not much room for state involvement when it comes to cultivated meat labels. That will largely be up to USDA and FDA. And USDA actually requires pre-market approval for labels, so the agency will really have quite a lot of authority when it comes to telling companies what they can and can't call these foods. And so whether they're going to allow these companies to use terms that are more or less favorable is kind of yet to be seen. There are some terms like lab grown or cultured that can be less favorable to consumers, can turn consumers off understandably, and that also just aren't a very accurate description of what these products are. A GFI advocates for a more neutral term like cultivated because it's not already used to describe any meat products on the market. But we just don't really know yet what that labeling scheme will look like from the federal government. And then in terms of the plant-based and the fermentation-derived foods, which are regulated mostly by FDA, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, which is what gives FDA labeling authority, doesn't have the same all-encompassing preemption provision and does leave more room for state regulation, which has led to a handful of states passing some really restrictive laws that we refer to as label censorship laws that prevent plant-based products from using terms like burger or sausage or butter on their product labels, even if they're qualified and include terms like vegan or meatless or plant-based. And lawmakers in these states seem to want plant-based products to instead use a term like veggie disc or plant-based spread, even though consumer research really shows that these vague terms are confusing to consumers, and that terms like plant-based chicken nuggets or soy-based burger are actually a lot more clear for shoppers. And so a big part of my work involves challenging these state laws in court.
Yeah, so tell us more about those challenges, because it does seem like in certain states that are, I'm assuming, predominantly like beef and meat producing states, like they've essentially passed laws claiming that the beef industry has a monopoly on the word burger, for example, or otherwise trying to regulate what can actually be called meat. So what does that litigation look like, and how has it implicated the First Amendment?
Yeah, so when we challenge these label censorship laws, we do primarily rely on the First Amendment, and specifically the First Amendment's commercial speech protections. The Supreme Court has held both that the First Amendment protects a company's non-misleading commercial speech, but it also confers a right on consumers to receive accurate commercial information. And many of these laws impose speech restrictions despite the fact that the speech they're restricting doesn't mislead consumers. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, actually helps consumers understand what these products are, how they can be used in recipes, what the taste might be like, what the texture might be like. And so most of these cases fall under a Supreme Court test set out in a case called Central Hudson Gas and Electric versus Public Service Commission. And that test, it has three prongs, requires the government to assert a substantial state interest that it's seeking to protect with a speech restriction. Second, its speech restriction has to directly advance that interest. And third, the speech restriction can't be more extensive than necessary to serve the government's stated interest. So similar to other kind of First Amendment tests. And we would certainly agree that protecting consumers from confusion and deception is a very valid government interest. We have lots of laws out there, lots of both federal and state regulations that are meant to prevent kind of consumer confusion and deception in the marketplace and fraud and things like that. But the issue with these state label censorship laws is that they aim to prevent consumer confusion over plant-based meat labels without actually being able to demonstrate that there is any consumer confusion over plant-based meat labels. And in fact, there's quite a bit of consumer research on the other side of the coin demonstrating that the use of meat terms or species terms or milk terms on these labels increases consumers' understanding about the product, as long as you're using qualifying language like plant-based or meatless or soy-based or oat milk or things like that. These restrictions also really almost always fail that third prong and are a lot more extensive than necessary because they just broadly prohibit the use of terms, often without providing any sort of safe harbor for labels that clearly aren't misleading and clearly do explain that these products are not made with animal meat. And the states were really concerned that consumers might, for some reason, think a soy-based burger contains meat. There are all sorts of other ways to fix that problem, including requiring some additional language on a label rather than restricting the use of the term burger. And in general, First Amendment jurisprudence really favors more speech and not less. So that's really kind of the primary way that we have challenged these laws in court.
And what's the state of that type of litigation? Have courts largely been ruling in your favor, or have they been upholding these censorship laws? Like, what does that look like actually play out in the courts?
Yeah, so several of the courts have found that the companies that have challenged these laws so far don't have standing, because in the court's view, those companies' labels don't violate these laws because they're so clear and not misleading. So some courts have held that, Tofurkey's plant-based deli slices, label just doesn't violate the law because it clearly says plant-based and because it's not making a misrepresentation. And so some of these cases kind of haven't gotten very far on that issue specifically. But several of the courts have found that these do violate the First Amendment. The Middle District of Louisiana had an opinion come out last year finding that Louisiana's label censorship law can't pass the central Hudson test and does violate the First Amendment. There was also an Arkansas ruling that came out late last year that also found that Arkansas's label censorship law violated the First Amendment as it applied to Tofurkey's label specifically. Tofurkey was the plaintiff in that case. And then we have a couple of other cases still pending in Missouri and in Oklahoma, and there's also an appeal pending in that Louisiana case.
Got it. So it sounds like you've won a few cases, you have a few pending, and even the cases that have been thrown out on standing grounds, it sounds like they've been thrown out in a way that actually narrows the scope of these laws, right? By showing that certain alternative protein companies are already in compliance with it.
Right.
Okay. And is GFI the litigating organization in these cases? Like, what role do you all play in this type of litigation?
Yeah, so we are counsel in several of these cases. There's also other organizations that work on them, including the Animal Legal Defense Fund and the Plant-Based Foods Association. And in the past, some libertarian organizations have also been involved. So it's kind of a variety of organizations.
Great. So aside from the First Amendment,
I meant to mention the ACLU. They've also been involved in several cases.
The ACLU, that's quite a coalition. Yeah.
I know, couldn't forget about them.
Aside from the First Amendment, tell us about how the Dormant Commerce Clause under the Constitution comes into play for you.
Sure. Depending on how the law is written and the state that's writing it, there's a few ways that the Dormant Commerce Clause might come into play. In some cases, the label censorship laws clearly favor in-state conventional meat producers over out-of-state plant-based meat producers. Several of these laws have been passed in states that have really large animal agricultural industries. And if you look at the legislative history behind the bills and you look at the debates behind the bills, you have state legislators specifically saying that these bills are being introduced to protect these kind of historic industries. And if you have states that produce a lot of these animal-based products but don't produce plant-based products, then the laws may be a form of discrimination and protectionism against those newer out-of-state products. In addition, some of these laws also might regulate extraterritorial commerce because they prevent advertising, especially advertisements that might display food labels in the state that violate the state's law. But because of the nature of advertising these days, which occurs mostly online and on social media and is shared beyond the control of the company. Even advertisements that are created in other states and might be aimed at other state citizens could easily be viewed or claimed to be directed in a state that has one of these laws. So in that way, the law could be interpreted to be regulating commerce that falls outside of that state's own boundaries. And then the final way that the DCC sometimes comes up is that these laws really impose a substantial burden on interstate commerce. The laws can make it really difficult for plant-based companies to sell their products anywhere in the region where a state that has one of these laws is located, just because of the way that distribution agreements work in the food industry. If you're someone who's selling at, big stores like Walmart or Target or a grocery store chain, you're not necessarily in control of placing your product in certain stores or even in certain states. You usually have these regional agreements where you're selling your products to the distributors and then they're bringing them into the stores. And so it's really not possible for a company like that to make one label for Missouri and one for Arkansas and one for Oklahoma and one for Texas. So it really creates kind of a regulatory burden where the companies either have to change all of their labels for pretty much the entire country, or at least a large region, or choose to stop selling their products in an entire region. So there's a couple ways that the Dormant Commerce Clause has come up, although we haven't had any court rulings on it
yet. In practice, what have companies been doing in response to these laws, aside from litigating against them? Like, is it sort of becoming a lowest common denominator? They have to comply with the most restrictive label across the entire country, or are they creating custom labels, or are these laws just getting temporarily blocked by courts? Like, what's actually been played out on the ground? And
yeah, I mean, I certainly can't speak for all companies, but I know several of the companies that we've heard from have just sort of refrained from coming out with new labels or new advertisements if they're worried about products being sold in states that have these laws. In some states, these laws have been put on hold. Often when we file a challenge, the government will say, we're not going to enforce this until the case has been resolved, even without an injunction. They just voluntarily agree to wait and kind of see how everything plays out. In other cases, like in Mississippi, after the law came out and they were sued, the state agreed to promulgate regulations that would kind of carve out a bunch of safe harbors for plant-based products, as long as they use terms like plant-based or meatless or other things like that make it really clear on the label that they don't contain meat, which most of these products already do. And so they agreed to drop the lawsuit against the state in response to that. So it's kind of a bit of a mixed bag. But the other thing is that we haven't really seen enforcement actions under these laws yet, because so many of them are on hold, or because there's been so much publicity around the laws after these lawsuits. So I think how much companies decide to change their labels or stop selling products in certain regions might come after we actually see what it looks like when these laws are being enforced.
Okay, so we've talked about the First Amendment and the Dormant Commerce Clause. Are there any other constitutional issues that arise in your cases?
Yeah, one that arises a lot is the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. There's a lot of very vaguely written provisions in these laws that are really difficult to comply with, because you just don't know if what you're doing is or is not in compliance. So for example, Louisiana's label censorship law prohibits, I'll read the quote, utilizing a term that is the same as or deceptively similar to a term that has been used or defined historically in reference to a specific agricultural product, end quote. So I don't know any lawyer who knows what that means or how to advise a client whether or not they're in compliance with it, especially because terms within that sentence are mostly not defined in the statute, including like historic reference and agricultural product. So, that provision is just too vague to know whether or not you're violating it. And a lot of these laws are criminal. They come with both criminal fines and potential imprisonment. So definitely violate the Due Process Clause. And as I
I
mentioned
think
earlier,
I
there's also,
saw,
oh, go ahead.
sorry, Maddie, I was
Oh, it's
just
okay.
going to add on that point. I think it was in one of GFI's resources I saw that some of these laws could inadvertently wind up banning like beefsteak tomatoes or rice noodles, like foods that happen to have beef or like rice in their names, that have been around forever. So
Yeah,
some like
absolutely.
absurd results like that could come.
Yeah, no, it's true. And, it sounds ridiculous, but if you have a provision that's this broad and you're saying you can't use a term that's ever been used to refer to an agricultural product, and an agricultural product should be pretty much anything that comes from anything raised or grown and then turned into food. Right. In Louisiana, rice is a historical agricultural crop. So could you not use the word rice in any other context except when referring to one specific product? It certainly does apply more broadly than the plant-based meat products. And the only other thing I was going to mention is federal preemption is another issue that arises, but will probably be more relevant to cultivated meat products, just because those statutes do have stronger preemption provisions. And some of these label censorship laws do apply to cultivated meat products, but because they're on the market yet, no cultivated meat company has challenged them. So at the moment, we're more focused on their effect on the plant-based products, but in terms of cultivated, it's likely that they will be preempted by whatever USDA says these products can be called.
Just to remind everyone in the audience and those who joined late, please do use the Q&A function to submit any questions that you have for Maddie while we're talking. We'll leave time for your questions at the end. So in the meantime, we've been talking about defensive litigation and defensive legal issues that you confront. I wanted to switch to the more affirmative side. So what are the policy or regulatory tools that could be marshaled to support alternative?
Sure. Well, on the regulatory side, I think federal regulations that codify the very common and long used practice of labeling plant-based products using compound names. So terms like plant-based, soy-based, oat-based, things like that, with a term like milk or burger or sausage or butter, would go a long way towards providing clarity, both to industry and to consumers. There's quite a bit of research out there now that indicates that consumers understand these terms and that that's how they themselves refer to these products. FDA actually came out with labeling guidance today for plant-based milks and explicitly recognized that consumers understand what plant-based milks are, understand that they're not the same as cow's milk, and actually prefer terms like almond milk to a term like almond beverage, which just isn't as descriptive. So GFI has actually filed a citizen petition with FDA asking them for a very broad regulation that wouldn't be specific to alternative proteins, but would just generally apply to food labeling, sort of codifying FDA's longstanding practice of allowing these hybrid terms, because even things like rice noodles or rye bread are kind of in the same category, where noodles has a specific definition that rice noodles don't fall into, and bread has a specific definition that rye bread doesn't fall into. But no one is claiming that consumers don't know what rice noodles are. So I think a regulation like that codifies this practice would be very helpful and is something that we've advocated for. And then there's just a lot to be done on the legislative side. There are all sorts of federal and state funding mechanisms that can be used to support alternative proteins, both in terms of funding research and development, funding scaling, and then also funding workforce development. There's appropriations, tax incentives, grants, guaranteed load programs, probably many others that I'm missing because I'm not a lobbyist. But there's a lot of ways in which the government could be supporting this research, both at the federal and at the state level. And we've seen some support. California appropriated $5 million for alternative protein research at 3 of the UC schools last year. And before that, USDA created the first cellular agricultural center of excellence, which involves Tufts and Duke's and a few other universities to promote alternative protein research and specifically cultivated meat research at those universities, but there's certainly a lot of room for more funding. And it is pretty urgent, as I mentioned before. There are all these environmental benefits to alternative proteins, and they're pretty key because our food systems generally cause about a third of all human created GHGs, and then animal agriculture specifically is responsible for more than half of those. And so this is a problem that's not going away, and the government is already funding lots of other climate solutions, and this is kind of another kind of arrow in their quiver that could help us fight these kind of global problems. And then if the alternative protein industry kind of reaches the level that we think it can, the sector can generate more than 200,000 new jobs, which is also something that, the federal government is always looking to incentivize. So they really would get a return on their investment if they invested more in alternative proteins.
Yeah, you mentioned the comparison to renewable energy sources earlier, and I think that's really apt. When Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act last year, which was ostensibly, at least in part, a big climate bill, was there anything in there that was related to or helpful to alternative proteins, or did it not touch your industry at all?
Not directly necessarily like alternative proteins by name, but there certainly is increased funding and increased focus on sort of biotech as a climate solution, and that certainly encompasses alternative proteins among a number of other solutions. And so we're certainly urging the government to see alternative proteins as a piece of that increased funding for biotech and increased attention on kind of redoing our regulations on biotech that we haven't maybe changed since before a lot of these technologies were around, and kind of figuring new ways to safely kind of use new technology to help fight the climate crisis.
So Congress is also working on a big farm bill this year, I believe. Is there any expectation that could address alternative proteins?
Yeah, there's definitely opportunities within the Farm Bill. Again, I'm not a lobbyist, so I can't cite you the provisions of that very, very, very long bill to tell you where those are. Although if you are interested in learning more, please reach out to me. We have an awesome legislative team who knows all about this. But I do know there's a lot of opportunities in there for things like loan guarantee programs and grants and things like that could absolutely help both alternative protein research, and also things like helping farmers grow crops that can feed into these products. You think about a lot of these products need crops, farmers to be growing peas and soy and other things like that.
Great. So before we approach our last few minutes here, I wanted to just circle back to some of the questions around the litigation that you've been bringing in courts. And I was wondering, it sounds like some of it's still in the very early stages, but have any of your cases reached the federal courts of appeals? Do you anticipate any of the legal issues you face going up to the Supreme Court at some point? What's your expectation?
Yeah, there's one case right now pending before the Fifth Circuit. All of the other cases are at the district court level right now. Can't really predict anything about the Supreme Court these days, so I'll leave that one.
Yeah, that's a hard nut to crack. Well, great. So, stepping back from the legal issues here, how do you even outside of your legal lawyerly professional hat for GFI? How do you persuade skeptics who are maybe reluctant to try alternative proteins because they consider them unnatural or experimental? I'm wondering if you've encountered people in your life where you've had that type of conversation, and how do you try to persuade them that these are safe, these are good, and beneficial to try and to have?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just to dispel some of the myths surrounding these products. For cultivated meat that you're actually going to be able to go get at, a fancy restaurant in San Francisco, or hopefully soon in a grocery store, that's not created in a lab. Like the initial experimentation to figure out how do we make cultivated meat and how does this work and how do we do this at scale, like sure, that might be done in a lab, but this is going to be food, and it's going to be created in a food processing facility. If you've ever seen what a facility that makes cereal or ice cream or anything like that looks like, it's going to be similar to that. These are food processing facilities, that FDA has regulatory jurisdiction over, and the actual vats that are used for growing these cells look quite a bit like the vats that are used to make beer. So pretty much in your head, if you can imagine a brewery or a place that makes cereal, like when you see those Honey Bunches of Oats commercials, you can kind of get an idea of where these things are being produced. They're certainly not being made in, petri dishes with like pipettes and syringes or anything like that. I also think it's important to remember with respect to cultivated meat that it is real animal meat. It's comprised of the same types of muscle and fat cells that you'd find in a piece of meat that you go buy at the grocery store today. It just doesn't require slaughtering an animal to get there. So, a piece of cultivated chicken is going to have the same essential, biological and nutritional attributes as any other piece of chicken. And so what you're actually consuming really isn't going to be much different than what you already eat if you currently eat meat.
So we have a question and a compliment in the Q&A from Magda, who's a public health law professor, and would like to add these topics to the public health law syllabus. But Magda's question is whether the public health community is engaged in these issues, looking to understand the field of research and advocacy given some of the uncertainties around health benefits of, for example, soy products and presumed connections with estrogen-related health problems. So you could tell us anything about the health implications or public health impacts of alternative proteins?
Sure. So I wouldn't say that necessarily like public health organizations are that involved currently in promoting specifically alternative proteins. I think because this is so new, and my understanding, especially from like nutritionists, is, nutrition science takes a while and it takes a long time for kind of new products to end up kind of on their radar. But certainly a lot in the public health community have been promoting plant-based diets for a very long time. FDA recently put out a request for comments on a proposed rule related to like using the term healthy on food labels. And several, physicians groups and public health groups commented on, making sure that whatever FDA is trying to encourage includes, more plant-based foods, not less. So I'd be happy to kind of share more both of resources like that and also our own kind of internal thinking on how alternative proteins can be kind of a source for good in the public health space. If you reach out to me, I have lots of written resources to provide. And yeah, would definitely be happy to talk to anybody about that further.
Yeah, that sounds great, Maddie. If you are comfortable, you could probably put your, we don't have a chat, do we? But you could probably put your contact info in the Q&A. In terms of what ACS members who are interested in these issues can do, what do you recommend lawyers in particular, but people in general do to engage around issues related to alternative?
Yeah, I mean, for lawyers, it kind of depends on what you do. Certainly if you work on the Hill and you're interested in these issues, I think this is kind of a thing that is very new for a lot of congressmen and senators, and is definitely something that we'd love to provide more education on. So I could certainly provide you with resources or connect you to our legislative team. Like we were just talking about, if you work in health policy, nutrition, environmental policy, climate, biodiversity, any of those issues, I think there's a lot of places where that kind of work can intersect with what we do and can help sort of spread in those communities kind of the benefits of alternative proteins. Because it's another thing, because this is so new, GFI itself is only about 6 years old, and cultivated meat has only been around, at least the first actual cultivated meat, since I think 2014. So it's kind of a new area, and so we're always looking for ways to sort of get other kind of interest groups who do care about the same issues as us and have the same goals as us, to kind of work towards a common goal and kind of put our heads together and think about ways that alternative proteins can be like a co-solution alongside a lot of other solutions, because we're talking about big global problems here. So we certainly don't think that alternative proteins are some sort of silver bullet that are going to, stop pandemics and AMR and feed the entire world and stop climate change, but they're certainly a big important piece of that. So yeah, if you work on any issues where you think there might be any intersection at all, I'm happy to chat or happy to provide resources. Just as individuals, I would say, because this is kind of a new issue, I'm not sure it's quite something yet where if you just write your senator or call your senator, they'll know what you're talking about, but you can always try. And also, if you enjoy these products, just keep consuming them and enjoying them, because that's a signal to these companies that they're doing something right. Also provide feedback. A lot of the companies that are making these products are still pretty small and have lots of room for development and to change what they're doing. So if they get feedback from consumers about what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong, they can make changes. And that doesn't just mean you want it to taste better. It could also be in terms of sustainability and environmental benefits, or it could be in terms of nutrition. So those would be my suggestions. And like I said, feel free to reach out to me if you have any kind of questions or need more resources about this, because GFI has more resources than I could possibly ever list in a day.
On your last point about enjoying the products, what is your go-to alternative protein food item? Do you have a recipe that you recommend, or something that you've had recently that you enjoyed? I'm just wondering, on a personal level, how you incorporate alternative proteins into your regular diet.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's too many, and I definitely can't pick favorites, but I will say I had an Impossible chicken patty for lunch today with ketchup and pickles on sourdough, and it was amazing. And I did just see that they came out with spicy chicken patties and spicy chicken nuggets, which I'm definitely looking forward to trying. And also a big fan of any plant-based milk in smoothies. I think that's like the best possible breakfast when I'm taking breakfast in the car. So.
Excellent. Well, Maddie, thank you so much. This has been a really great discussion and touched on a lot of really interesting issues in a really exciting industry. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for those chapters who co-sponsored from across the country. If you want to learn more about alternative proteins and GFI, their website is gfi.org. And also, just to before we sign off, be sure to stay in touch with the ACS New York Lawyer Chapter. You can sign up for our emails at acslaw.org. Find us on Facebook. We're also on Twitter at ACS_NY. So stay in touch and be on the lookout for more great events like this one. But thank you all for spending part of your day with us, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks, everyone.